Hello, my name is Andrea Gauthier, and today I will be presenting on behalf of my colleagues on the iRead project about our research on how different learner groups process instructional feedback in a literacy game. The purpose of our research was twofold: to understand how feedback in learning games can support children with different characteristics in developing their reading and literacy abilities, and, based on these findings, to recommend strategies to improve the design of feedback in children's learning games. We performed this research as part of the European-funded iRead project, which aims to develop personalized learning technologies to support primary school children's reading skills. This is motivated in part by the fact that a quarter of children in the UK leave primary school without adequate reading skills, which puts them at risk during their secondary education. The project is primarily interested in how the same technology might support a range of learners, such as novice or beginner learners just learning to read, struggling readers or those with dyslexia who are at risk of exclusion from their education, and children who are learning English as a foreign language. The project capitalizes on the benefits of game-based learning, which has been shown to be as or more effective than other forms of education when properly designed. Games have the potential to increase motivation for learning through challenge, narrative, user control, rewards and achievement, customization, and clearly defined goals, all of which build a sense of immersion in the learning experience. Importantly, games offer a safe place for failure where learners can try out different ideas or hypotheses as part of the learning experience. This in turn fosters mastery through repetition, practice, and just-in-time feedback on errors. So the iRead team developed a literacy game called Navigo that follows an ancient Egyptian mystery narrative and immerses children in challenges that train their reading and literacy skills. Specifically, it contains over 900 activities and 16 minigame mechanics, 3 of which are pictured on this slide, that cover a range of reading skills including phonics and phonemic awareness, exception words, vocabulary, reading for meaning, and reading fluency. The study presented today involves one particular minigame called Perilous Paths, which exercises reading for meaning skills by getting children to analyze morphology of words. In this particular clip, you'll see a child completing a problem on prefixes.
It's not loud enough. Select the correct beginning to complete the word.
Dictionaries are fiction books. In.
These prefixes are all related to negatives or opposites. Think about how the prefix will change the meaning of the word you are trying to complete.
Non. Dictionaries are non-fiction books.
Good work. On to the next one.
Now you may or may not have picked up on some of the feedback features in this minigame that helped this child to understand that they made an error and then corrected that error. I'll go over what those are in a little bit, but first, let's discuss why feedback is important in learning games. Firstly, feedback can support learning in a number of ways. It can reduce cognitive load by bringing attention to key parts of the task. It can signal to a learner that there is a gap between their performance and the learning aim. And importantly, it can provide corrective information so that the learner can correct their strategy and progress in their learning. There are 2 overarching types of feedback: outcome feedback, which informs the learner about the correctness of their response, and elaborative feedback, which aims to evolve the learner's understanding. Both types of feedback can be delivered in different ways. They can be visual, such as visual effects that are embedded into the gameplay, or something more traditional like text or symbolic icons. They can also be verbal, such as sound effects or hints and prompts that might be narrated aloud. Or feedback can be multimodal and simultaneously provide both visual feedback and reinforced by verbal narration and vice versa. Some research suggests that verbal feedback may be more effective in games so that the visual processing system does not get overloaded. But ultimately, the effectiveness of feedback depends on its design and the mode of delivery chosen. Yet, there is a paucity of research investigating the design of game-based feedback for children, So this is a very fruitful area of investigation, especially when considering children with diverse learning needs, such as novice readers, struggling readers, and EFL learners. So our research questions are, how do visual outcome feedback features support children with different learning characteristics to evaluate their performance and understand their errors? And secondly, how does verbal elaborative feedback support these children to understand and recover from their errors? As a reminder, I'll replay a brief clip of the feedback presented in Perilous Paths when children provided wrong answers.
In.
These prefixes are all related to negatives or opposites. Think about how the prefix will change the meaning of the word you are trying to complete.
Specifically, there are 5 outcome feedback features. The border around the bridge turns red. The bridge breaks. The Sphinx shakes its head. The character returns to the starting position. And a red gem, or a game reward, is lost. And there are 2 elaborative feedback features. The incorrect answer is repeated, and a hint is read out loud. So to answer our research questions, we recruited 3 types of children who already were familiar with the Navigal game. Novice readers in Year 1, bridging into Year 2, aged 5 to 6. Children aged 8 to 11 who were identified by their teachers as struggling readers, but who didn't necessarily have a formal learning disability diagnosis. And children aged 9 to 10 in Sweden who were learning English as a foreign language. And only children who made at least 1 error while playing Perilous Paths were included in our analysis, since we were interested in how feedback supported understanding and recovery from errors specifically. The content or learning feature chosen to be played for each group was different because these children are at different stages in their reading development. However, in each case, a learning feature was chosen that would be familiar yet challenging for the children, and this was often identified by the teacher themselves. In the study, children played 1 round of Perilous Paths, consisting of 3 problems associated with the selected language feature. They played on tablets whilst their screens and verbalizations were recorded, and they were accompanied by a research facilitator who took an active intervention approach. So upon children's first error, the researcher would ask, "Did you get that answer correct or incorrect?" to identify if the child understood that they made an error. Then, "How do you know?" to identify if the child noticed particular visual outcome feedback features. Then, once the correct answer was chosen, the facilitator asked, "How did you choose your answer?" to determine if the elaborative feedback was instrumental in their decision, and if they didn't mention this elaborative feedback, the facilitator asked if the child heard the hint and whether it was helpful. We performed a thematic analysis of the screen recordings and children's vocalizations and coded items related to outcome feedback, such as whether the child understood that they made an error, whether the child noticed the outcome feedback, the total number of outcome feedback features that they noticed, and the specific features that they noticed. Similarly, for the elaborative feedback, we coded if the child noticed it, if the child understood it, with any explanation of how we determined that they understood, whether the child recovered after feedback, as in they got the next attempt correct, if they reported that they used any particular strategies other than relying on the hint to correct their answer, and finally, the total number of errors that they made during play. So what did we find in terms of our first research question on outcome feedback? We found that all children understood when they made an error, but that they were not always able to articulate how they knew. Only 71% of children mentioned that there was something in the game that indicated to them that they got the incorrect answer. While it appears that struggling readers were less proficient at this, there is no statistical difference between groups. Children across groups noticed about 1 outcome feedback feature each, which again was not different between groups. However, it appeared that the distribution of features noticed between groups might be different, so we performed an unplanned analysis that plotted features noticed as either no features noticed, 1 feature noticed, or 2 or more features noticed, and found a significant difference between groups. Specifically, novice readers were much more likely to notice only 1 single feature, whilst there was a trend in struggling readers to notice either 2 or more features or no features at all. There was also a small trend in EFL learners to notice 2 or more features. Finally, we identified the outcome features most noticed by children. The color change and the bridge breaking were by far the most noticeable features and served to effectively indicate to the child that they got the answer incorrect. Only a handful of children noticed any other features. Secondly, our findings regarding elaborative feedback revealed that children also noticed verbal elaborative feedback, but attention to this was very different between groups. Only 40% of novice readers reported noticing the hint, whilst 90% of EFL learners noticed it. One thing that caught my eye in this analysis was that 56.3% of struggling readers noticed the elaborative feedback, and, if you remember, 56.3% also noticed the outcome feedback. So I thought to myself, are these the same children who are noticing both types of feedback? It turns out no. A trend suggests that struggling readers will either notice the visual outcome feedback features or the verbal elaborative feedback features, but not both, which I thought might have interesting implications. But going back to our sample as a whole, just because children noticed the feedback, that doesn't mean that they necessarily understood it. Of those who claimed to notice the feedback, only 4 children could actually describe its meaning and apply it in their next attempt. Most children reported hearing but not remembering the hint. Now, in some cases of struggling readers and novice readers, this might be because they weren't paying attention, and some continued to run around in the game while the hint was being narrated, like in this example.
Okay, great.
Select the correct beginning to complete the word.
It is healthier to eat fatty food.
This, that, non, that,
Don't tap on the bridge that you want.
okay.
This,
These prefixes are all related to negatives or opposites. Think about how the prefix will change the...
da,
These prefixes are all related to negatives or opposites. Think about...
non,
Others heard the hint but did not fully process it, treating it instead as outcome feedback. Listen to this example of a struggling reader.
And did you hear the hints that the back gave you? Do you know what they said?
It's not correct.
And did you hear the other hints that it was saying?
I forgot.
You forgot? Okay, that's fine.
So in that example, it's clear that the child heard something and interpreted that it meant that he was incorrect, but upon further inquiry, he could not actually report what the hint actually said. Lastly, it's possible that some children, particularly the novice readers, did not have the adequate background knowledge for the elaborative feedback to be of any help. So this audio clip demonstrates a novice reader's clear confusion.
What did it do? To let you know.
It said these are not prefixes.
So what she reports here is fundamentally wrong because all of the options available to her were actually prefixes. So it's clear that she's having challenges with the content in and of itself. And this is corroborated by the number of errors that novice readers made in the game, which were much greater than those made by other children. Despite the higher number of errors made by novice readers, after the child's first error, children across groups were equally likely to recover at a rate better than chance. But how did they do this if they weren't using the hint for help? Well, several children reported just guessing or choosing at random, and this was particularly prevalent amongst the novice readers. Other children applied an implicit learning strategy by either repeating the phrase out loud or in their head to get a sense of what sounds right, like in this audio clip.
Because if you say, I can't say with certainty what time I will come home, then it just wouldn't make sense.
So this type of strategy was seen much more frequently in the struggling readers and EFL groups in comparison to the novice readers. And finally, a small number of children applied homemade strategies, such as never selecting the same answer twice in a row, or like this child choosing the same answer twice in a row. So here he chooses the negative prefix non and gets it correct on his first try, but only because non was correct in the previous round.
Did you get that one right or wrong?
Right.
How did you know you got it right?
Because the last one was,
Yeah, so that was why you selected it.
So what does all this data suggest about our first research question regarding outcome feedback? Well, we saw that all children knew that they made an error, but were not always able to articulate what helped them understand this. In the case of novice readers, who primarily noticed only one visual outcome feedback feature, this may be because they have less developed visual attention capabilities than, say, EFL children. For struggling readers who either noticed many features or no features at all, this may be due to several reasons. Firstly, this group is expected to be quite neurodevelopmentally diverse, with some having greater difficulties than others in, say, visual processing, verbal working memory, and/or selective attention. So, a child's capacities in any one of these domains might influence their abilities to perceive and process feedback. Alternatively, struggling readers may have rapid naming difficulties, so perhaps they did notice the visual outcome feedback features, but were unable to spontaneously verbalize these. This is in contrast to EFL children in our sample, who are probably neurotypical and frequently reported observing more than one visual outcome feature. Lastly, children tended to notice feedback features at the center of the screen, which were embedded into the gameplay rather than on the periphery. And then we looked at how verbal elaborative feedback supported understanding and recovery. We saw that the verbal hint was ineffective across all groups, and children relied on other strategies to recover from their errors. This differs from existing recommendations on game-based feedback, which suggests using a verbal modality for elaborative feedback. But again, previous research has mainly been performed with adult learners. Many novice and some struggling readers ignored the verbal hint altogether and continued to play during the narration, which may be due to attentional capacities in these groups. This behavior can potentially be remedied through interruptive feedback that forces the player to stop and not move until the feedback is delivered, to focus attention. Ultimately, novice readers aged 5 to 6 may be unable to attend to multimodal forms of feedback. Some research suggests that children at this age rely solely on visual working memory, and that verbal working memory is only regularly applied by age 11. Furthermore, it's unclear whether the elaborative feedback for novice learners would have been effective anyway, due to the lack of comprehension of prefixes seen in a subset of these children. But older children, who we know were familiar with the content of the game, also could not incorporate the elaborative feedback. Struggling readers may have been challenged due to deficits in working memory, and EFL children may have struggled because they had to decode or translate the English hint into their native language to understand it. So what does this mean for designing game feedback for children with different learning abilities? Firstly, that any important visual outcome feedback features should be central in the screen and embedded in the focal learning content. We should also try to avoid verbal-only elaborative feedback and scaffold verbal hints with visual supports. If there is any AI underlying the game, this should assess whether the learner is struggling and stop the game flow with interruptive feedback that is visual but supported by verbal cues. And finally, novice readers who are not as familiar with the learning content may need additional instruction and scaffolding outside the game to support their understanding. While we believe our findings to be of broad interest, we would like to acknowledge some limitations of the work, including our small sample size, a lack of prior knowledge measurement, differences in who conducted the research in different countries, and potential procedural limitations, for instance, whether additional prompts from the facilitator would have elicited greater verbalizations from children. Thank you so much for listening.